Your documentary broadcast in the UK and the shock of the truth, it's also expanding in Japan since then. And the other victim of the Johnny Kitagawa, they came out and they talking about their experience. And Japanese major media companies, they could not touch this issue at the beginning. However, fans of the Johnny's idols, they made a new group for this issue and they sent a letter to Johnny and Associate to do the investigation over the issue. And Julie Keiko Fujishima released a video and statement for apology. And finally, the major Japanese media companies, they start to broadcast this issue. So then many Chinese idols, they left the company, Johnny and Associate. So your documentary was beginning for all those like giant shock. What do you think about it?
So firstly, I'm really grateful to the public in Japan, and it's worth saying that the documentary, of course, it was a big team effort. I worked with a brilliant director who is British and also Japanese, Komagumi Inman, who was my guide and my translator and provided so much backing and put the film together. Of course, I also, as you see in the film, worked with the journalists at the publication Bunshun, who originally uncovered this story. So this whole documentary was a long time in the making. I'm extremely pleased with the response in terms of the Japanese public, and I'm extremely happy that at last some of the mainstream media seems to be talking about this. But I do not think we are close to justice yet. I think the statement from Julie Fujishima, whilst I welcome it, and I watched the video, I read the translation several times, and I watched the video over and over again. I do not believe that Julie Fujishima, her claim that she was unaware of these allegations, I do not believe that is true. She must have been aware of these allegations because I contacted her multiple times. What you do not see in the film, there is a moment whilst we were filming on two separate occasions where I went to Julie Fujishima's home. I went to her home after contacting via the formal routes. I went to her home, I rang the doorbell, I spoke to someone, I told them why I was there, I told them I was from the BBC, I told them the nature of the questions that I wanted to ask. She wouldn't open the door. She wouldn't have a conversation. So we didn't include that in the final cut of the documentary. But that tells me that, of course, she was aware of these allegations. And the fact is, Julie Fujishima is not just the head of the company. Of course, she is also the niece of Johnny Kitagawa. So for her whole life, she has benefited financially from the exploitation of these young men and these boys at the hands of her uncle. So I do not believe it is good enough in any way to say, I'm sorry, I didn't know this was happening. I would also say, and this is the main thing, at the moment in Julie Fujishima's statement, she said that they are not going to have a third party, a kind of, external organization or external individuals come in and do an investigation. I think that is a huge mistake, and I think it has to happen. I think external individuals who have expertise in this area must be allowed access to all the information and to all the people who they need to conduct a thorough investigation. I think all of the survivors who have bravely spoken out and who I believe will continue to speak out should be offered compensation. I believe they should be offered counseling. I believe they should be supported. You've got to understand that so many of the young people that I met, even the people that you don't see in the film, they, as adults today, are really struggling to come to terms with what happened to them. And that is the nature of sexual abuse. That's the nature of grooming. Men like Johnny Kitagawa will suggest to young people that there's some kind of special relationship, that they have some kind of special secret, and that allows them to be abusive. And so I believe an investigation has to happen. I believe Johnny and Associates should be offering support, compensation, counseling to all of these now men, then, young boys who are brave enough to come forward and speak. And I believe there has to be a degree of accountability. I understand, of course, Johnny Kitagawa is now gone. He's dead. And so in that sense, there will never be justice. But I believe it is morally bankrupt. It's morally reprehensible that Johnny and Associates still bears his name and still continues to make money off the exploitation that went on at his hands. I don't think that should continue.
Why and how did you start to make a documentary about Johnny Kitagawa?
So I've been interested in the world of kind of pop culture, but also exploitation within pop culture for many years. And I guess the other subjects I really make films about, often I make films about drugs, exploitation, the sex industry. I myself am from a Pakistani background. So my parents came to the UK in the 70s. I was born in the UK. And so I'm interested in kind of international cultures. The first time I heard about Johnny Kitagawa was, I think it was just when he died, actually. And I started then with the team at the BBC, looking into the obituaries and everything that was being written about him at the time. And that's when the team came across some of the Bunchen articles. And I remember at the time we had discussions about how this felt like it was a story that was kind of just laying dormant. It was a story that was kind of within the public consciousness, but no one seemed to really be engaging with it or reporting. And of course, there is always a moral question as well, because I'm not Japanese. I visited Japan, prior to making this film as a tourist. I love Japan. I love Japanese culture, but I'm not Japanese. And so there's always a moral discussion as well about, is it really right for me to be doing this job? But the thing is, because I've spoken to and interviewed survivors of sexual abuse, I've interviewed many sex workers, I've interviewed people who have been trafficked for sexual exploitation over many, many years. I felt for those reasons, I was qualified to be able to cover this story. And then we assembled a team, which included local people within Tokyo. It included a British-Japanese director who'd worked extensively inside Japan. And that's when we began doing the research. Of course, then the lockdown happened. So the pandemic happened. So originally I was going to be coming over, I think in 2020. Of course, then everything went into lockdown. So then we had to wait for the borders to open back up again. And that's why we ended up making this film in 2022.
How do the people in the UK react to your documentary? Have you received feedback from the audience?
Completely. So I think I've received a lot of feedback from people within the UK, and also the film has been seen internationally. So it's been broadcast by various broadcasters throughout Europe, throughout the US. So I have to say there's been two different kinds of responses. So generally, the response has all been very positive in the sense that people agree that this needs to be spoken about, and they often make comparisons. So they make comparisons to a man called Jimmy Savile, who you may be aware of. So Jimmy Savile was a very prolific pedophile in the UK. They make comparisons to people like Michael Jackson, of course. But then that's the kind of general response. But then I have to say, amongst the international Japanese diaspora, so Japanese people who were born and raised in the US or Canada or Europe or around the world, so many of those people have got in touch with me on social media, or they've emailed me, and they have said that they really believe these conversations have to happen in Japan. And I think I've been very, very encouraged by that, because, sometimes I think being an outsider is really, really helpful. And the fact that I'm not from Japanese culture, many of the men that I spoke to, they said they found it easier to speak to me, primarily because they felt less pressure and they felt less shame, because they didn't think that I'd be judging them in the way that sometimes, Japanese society can have quite strict parameters for what is and isn't acceptable. And so in that instance, many people who've got in touch are glad that I was able to go over and to make this documentary. I also have to say one other thing, another set of responses that has come through. And this is, again, this is internationally, but mainly from inside Japan. People have been in touch who also say that they worked at Johnny and Associates, and they also claim to have been abused. So people that have not spoken in the public domain yet have also been in touch with me. And in those instances, I think those individuals, I want to express absolute solidarity and respect for them. I think it is a really brave and important thing to be able to speak out. So I'm absolutely sure that there will be people who will hear about this story. There are people perhaps who will watch this interview who may have experienced abuse and do not feel ready to speak out. And I really want to say to those people, I respect you, and I think it's incredibly brave. And when and if you feel ready, speak to someone for your own well-being, for your own sanity. Even if you don't want to speak about it in the public domain, see a counselor, speak to someone you trust, because it's about taking care of yourself. And I think that's the most important thing.
Have you ever get any negative response from any audience or fans from Japan?
The only negative response I had is some people on social media, as you suggest, would say this shouldn't be spoken about. Johnny Kitagawa is dead. There's no point in addressing it. And I would say to all of those people, yes, of course he's dead, but justice to some extent can still be served. And also, the most important thing, I believe, is in terms of the culture of silence, that must change. Because in all societies around the world, there is exploitation. Of course, this isn't exclusive to Japan in any way, but the only way that changes is if individuals feel empowered enough to speak out and to speak up. And in this instance, I think we should commend every individual who has spoken about surviving abuse, because they are the pioneers of this movement. And it is through them that the culture of silence will be dismantled. And I think that is the most important thing. So I would appeal to anyone who can speak out to speak out. The power, I would say, is now with you. It is no longer with Johnny Kitagawa. And I hope and continue, I appeal to every section of the press, every journalist, every broadcaster, every newspaper, every person on social media to speak out and to use their platform to challenge the culture of abuse. I think it has to stop.